Hi everybody, and welcome to the prep video for the timeline mapping workshop. Try to get us all set and ready to go for our workshop on Monday. So let's go ahead and begin kind of with just a recap of where we are in the process. Right? Our first step is, of course, to create a great question, right? A sharp, strategic question where we have clarity on what are the boundaries, what's our time horizon, what are the important forces of change that we are going to focus on. And once we have that lens through which to look into the topic, then we go deep in our background research, right? And that's the step we're in now. We had a workshop last week on systems thinking, and today or this week we'll have our historical assessment. Once we have that background research, then we look towards trend analysis and build our baseline forecast of where continuous change will lead us. And once we have that in hand, then we're in a great position to introduce uncertainty and disrupt our baseline and look at a range of alternative scenarios. So that's the process we're using here. And of course, the two aspects of background research, we've already done our systems analysis, right, where we looked at things like stakeholder analysis and who are the most influential and most interested stakeholders and what keeps them awake at night, and what are the forces of change and what's their status and trajectory, and looked at diagramming our system visually to get the other side of the creative side, the spatial side of our brain in play. And the other side of background research is historical assessment, right? Trying to gain an understanding of where this system has come from, what are the disruptions and transitions and eras that it has worked through. And when we combine our framing lens and our systems assessment and our historical assessment together, we really are in a great position to create the opening section of our main report, which we call our current assessment. So this particular workshop will be around historical analysis and in particular timeline mapping. So let's go ahead and dig into it. Right? The historical analysis process is one where we want to look at not just trends and continuous change, but that's where we begin, but then also look at what are the potential disruptions, which can come either in the form of some disruptive event or in the form of a debate around an issue that where the outcome is not defined yet. And when we combine these, we get the transition through historical periods that have a clear beginning and a disruption that ended it and a transition into the next era. And it's a pretty simple concept, and it can be really powerful if we use it well. So the timeline mapping process, what we want to do is not just get an understanding of where are we now, right? What's the state of the art of the technology or the economics or the current societal situation, but equally important, from where have we come? And so we begin by looking at the past, and we find those evolutionary forces of change that have unfolded, and some of them are continuous and create an interesting dynamic of flow from the past smoothly into the present. And others are, again, more disruptive, and so we can look for the patterns of disruption and try to define those eras. And this is a really powerful concept because, remember, our intention here is to describe the future in a range of plausible alternatives which you can consider as eras of the future. So this puts the wheel in motion, so to speak. So what are we talking about with a timeline? Well, as I mentioned in class, the sort of textbook framing time horizon is 10 years. So if you're using 10 years, we know that the kind of rule of thumb is to look back twice as far as we look forward. So in this instance, it would be looking forward or looking back 20 years. And understanding how change has unfolded from that 20-year period in the past up to the present. And more importantly, what we want to do is understand that it's not just one progression of change, but really multiple progressions of change. And so what we want to do is do our best to categorize the things that are the sort of the buckets of change that we're considering in our topic. And where do we find those? Well, those are the categories that show up in your central question, and they also show up in your force field assessment at the back end of your systems assessment. So what you see, what we're trying to do is create this this real clear defining language for our topic. And what I want you to be thinking about is that if technological change or demographic shifts or whatever are the categories of change, shifts in demand, for example, then what we want to do is look at how change has unfolded along those categories and kind of stack them such that we can create a synthesis and find the patterns between them. So what I want you to be thinking about are, for the categories of change, if you looked back 20 years, how would you describe how change, both continuous and discontinuous, has unfolded in each of those categories? And as we overlook them, then we get the full timeline assessment. Okay? So there's another framework or tool that I want to introduce at this point. And that is, as we try to create this synthesis of these sort of nested timelines across the various categories, I want to have you use a tool called a Janus cone. So this is a framework that was developed, and it's used by friends of ours with the Foresight program out at Stanford, and I like it a lot. What it does is it enables us to create a real clear visual, if you will, understanding of how change has unfolded through prior eras to tell the story that gets us to the status quo, to the present. And the reason we do this is that, again, it's our intention to look forward into the other side of this, which is the future, and essentially into those eras of the future. So this is another graphical, visual way of looking at one aspect of our project, which is the historical aspect, and create the connection between the past, the present, and then serve as a springboard for the future. So let's look at an example, just to give you guys a simplified perspective of this. And so sustainability, right? It's a topic that is maybe a good fit with some of the stuff that you guys are working on, and certainly could be a topic where we look at what would the future of the sustainability movement be. And in order to understand where it might be going, we want to understand where it came from. So let's look back in time. So we look for the intriguing moments in history, and really, as we came through the Industrial Revolution and through the beginning of the 20th century and into, say, the era of World War II, we had great technological progress and great innovation and economic growth, but we did not really have an understanding of the consequential impact on our environment. And then in the early to late 60s, we started to find some signals, some clues that some things were going on. And it began with a book by the name of Silent Spring by a woman by the name of Rachel Carson. Maybe some of you have read this book, where she did some observation and assessment, mostly focused on the use of pesticides, and that these, in particular, a pesticide, a very effective pesticide by the name of DDT, and the idea that the environmental effects were starting to become apparent, right? And in particular, bird eggs were not hardening, and as a consequence, the birds were not hatching, and it was causing big ecological problems that were a signal of a lot of other types of ecological problems. And then later in that same decade, pollution started to really become apparent, and one example that is commonly used is in the Cleveland area, the river there, a very industrial area, became so polluted that it actually caught on fire, and it was a very visual, very vivid assessment for everyone to see that, hey, something is happening here that we need to be aware of. And so that led us to a societal movement, right? We mobilized and we created the EPA and different sorts of societal things like Earth Day and other sorts of rallies in the ecological movement and things of that nature started to emerge. And so society was shifting, and you could see that there was a shift in the air. Well, big business responded to that, and their primary response was one of resistance. Right? They saw that these new regulations and these new prohibitions on the stuff that they were trying to do would hurt their businesses. Right? And they took the point of view that, you know, overall the change that they're creating, plastics and other sorts of cleaning agents and things that made our lives better. And yeah, there's some residual side effects, but overall our world is better. And so they went through this period where they tried to delay and minimize and do as little as they could to comply as late as they could and that sort of thing. Well, in the next couple of decades, we saw some industrial events that were really just hard to ignore, right? The 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in Pennsylvania, and a chemical disaster in Bhopal, India, with a cyanide gas leak with a company called Union Carbide that killed lots and lots of people in a small town, and again more nuclear activity with the Chernobyl accident in the Soviet Union, and of course the Exxon Valdez tanker spill off the coast of Alaska. And so big business had trouble pointing to the fact that, hey, they just can't ignore this anymore. So we started to see them start to look for ways of collaborating and working through this, trying to seek value, right? And so we talked about the Brundtland Report, where sustainability was defined, and the Earth Summit in 1992, the formation of the U.S. Green Building Council, the Kyoto Protocol, where we were trying to find ways to draw business back into the equation, but really still to a certain extent with a regulatory point of view. And then we started to see some motion in things that would actually empower business to create value, right? The biomimicry movement and cradle-to-cradle movement and that sort of thing. And suddenly business noticed that, hey, you know what, we could create value out of this. And so that led to all sorts of new green business initiatives and that sort of thing. And then most recently, kind of blend between the regulatory side and business innovation side. And so it unfolded in this way. And these are all moments in history that we can go and understand and capture and include in our assessment. So if we look to understand how this would lead into a Janus cone, we can say, well, if we have all of these data points, we can lay a Janus cone over it, and we can look and say, you know what, there was an era of an awakening where we realized something needed to change. And then we had the era of reluctant compliance. And then finally we had the era of what we call sustainable value, which we're sort of maybe in the late days of. And the question is then, where does it go from here? So we've got this workshop, and let's talk through how I'd like to see you do that same sort of process on your topic, right? So the objectives for the workshop is, we started the force field analysis at the end of the systems mapping workshop, and I want you to use that as a springboard here, right? That the categories and the forces of change should be very well aligned, and these are not two separate processes; they are two complementary processes. So consider this a continuation of our first workshop. Map your timelines aligned with those categories, and go out of your way to seek alignment between your central question, your force field analysis, and the categories in your timelines. And then finally use the Janus cone to define the relevant triggers and eras as they fit in your topic. So that's what we seek to accomplish in the workshop. We look forward to seeing all of you in class on Monday. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.